Hi, everyone, and welcome once again to one of our Hobby Memorial Library events. We have with us today CTC Government Professor Dr. Um, Anthony Jordan. We were talking about different names and I completely blanked out. Welcome so much. And you're going to talk to us today about the Constitution and some lesser known struggles. So this should be really, really exciting. So welcome and thank you so much. And I'm going to let you go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. As mentioned, today's going to be lesser known struggles with the Constitution. Um, at one point, it was going to be called lesser known laws, but there wasn't as ripe of an area. And then this idea of like foolish or stupid laws is kind of a cottage industry on the internet. So I wanted to try to give you something new, maybe something you hadn't heard before, and if you haven't heard it before, my goal would be, well, you'll think about it a lot more. So that's my, goal for kind of switching it up. So sorry that the advertising was a little different, but I think it's going to be rewarding all the same. And I do have a works cited page for everything I used, even some stuff I didn't use. It's available upon request. Either contact me directly, go through the library. They know how to get me. So I'm happy to share it because all the works, and they were all books, were ones I got from the Hobby Library here on campus. So I think it's really important that I use resources from here to shape what I'm going to talk about. So for the work itself, I'm going to work around multiple arguments. That's what I'm going to try to illustrate with the evidence I have. For starters, one argument is that division is normal in the United States. I think today, maybe more than most times in our recent past, it feels like we're as divided as we can be. We can't agree on anything. A lot, just working in the political process feels futile. And we look back at the past and with admiration and say, wow, they always got along. It was always harmonious, or at least feels that way to a lot of people. And that really isn't the case. There's not a lot of evidence to support that. So I'm hoping to back that up. Also, this idea of adoring the Constitution. We do that today. It's survived 200 years. We think the world of it, and we should. But that doesn't mean everyone throughout our entire history felt that way. In fact, even at the very early stages of the Constitution, there were many who were highly critical of it and really didn't even want it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So the founders are just as divided as we are, and they revered the Constitution probably far less than we do. That's more of a relatively recent thing we do. We put this mythology around the founders, we have this mythology around the Constitution, and if you ask the founders themselves, they would have wondered why we would do that. That wouldn't have made a lot of sense to them. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and what I hope support it enough to convince you. Also, the founders were not always harmonious. In fact, it seems like they were seldom harmonious. And they certainly weren't always civil. I'm going to have a few stories about that, small stories, but stories about that. And ultimately, my evidence to back me up in this goal will be Alexander Hamilton's experiences. That's kind of going to be my small introduction. And then the main piece is going to be the quest for ratification in Rhode Island. Rhode Island was the 13th state, the final state of the original 13 to ratify the Constitution. It took a long time. I'm going to explain to you why it took such a long time and explain about Rhode Island's history. But I'm going to start off with Hamilton because he's enjoyed kind of a renaissance, I guess, over the past decade. Become a very popular figure. People want to talk about him. Obviously, there's the play. And he is known as the father of the Constitution. I found it apropos to put him in this presentation. So I want to talk a little bit about Hamilton. And Hamilton first started kicking around the idea of having a constitution in 1780, even though the convention itself wouldn't happen until 1787. Hamilton spent those 7 years working on people, whether it's politicians, men of influence, maybe some common people, to convince them for the need to replace the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. Hamilton worked really hard, though we're going to see evidence, in one of my sources, Rossiter, would argue, though Hamilton put all this work into having a convention and changing our form of government, his actual influence on the document itself is pretty small. In the Constitution, there aren't a lot of places where you can read clauses or phrases, point to and say, aha, that's distinctly Hamilton. Not a lot of it in the Constitution, but he was a big champion of it, along with James Madison. So there's going to be evidence that suggests Madison really did like the Constitution, thought this would be the final stop. Hamilton never seemed convinced that the Constitution was the final step. It was an improvement, but it was not perfection. Also, while advocating for the Constitution on June 18, 1787, Hamilton was accused of arguing for a monarchy and for the liquidation of state governments. Pretty big claims at the time, considering we just got out of the Revolutionary War. So for that time, that's a pretty big insult. I know it wouldn't feel like it here in 2022, but in 1787, pretty big insult. And Hamilton kind of left himself open to it. Some of his ideas that didn't make it into the Constitution was considering that the upper chamber, which would eventually be called the Senate, kind of wanted to structure it after the House of Lords in Great Britain, where there'd be some members of Congress who would serve for life. Wasn't really a popular idea. I think at one time he floated the idea of having the president be elected to a 10-year term. That obviously wasn't very popular, and it would have been tough for Washington to serve that. So you could put those pieces together and say, okay, that's why someone would criticize him for arguing for a monarchy, but it's still a pretty harsh critique. So Hamilton, while he thought the Constitution was imperfect, he was a practical guy. And that's going to be another lesson for the day, practicality. Something's better than nothing. You know, Thomas Jefferson once said, half a loaf's better than no loaf at all. And Hamilton knew that hopefully over time we could improve the Constitution and it could be closer to his goal. But that didn't mean he was in love with it. It meant he saw this as better than what we had. And Hamilton worked in reality. But he didn't think it was perfect. And Hamilton, once we get our government up and going, once the Constitution gets ratified, Hamilton's going to serve as the first Secretary of the Treasury. And Hamilton really had a lot to gripe about with this job. I'm not going to go into it all. But there's one thing that bothered him. A lot of people would critique his actions as secretary as unconstitutional. In the partisan newspapers of the time, they would take a lot of shots at him, especially the anti-federalists, who would become the Democratic Republicans. And Hamilton was kind of bothered by this. From Hamilton's perspective, the same people who fought him on getting the Constitution ratified were the first ones rushing out to say, oh, you're acting in an unconstitutional manner. That frustrated him because they're treating the Constitution as something so important and precious, but they were never really supportive of having the Constitution. So that annoyed him, even though Rossiter in the book would argue that Hamilton was probably being a little unfair. But from Hamilton's perspective, that's how he felt. Also, there were blind spots in the Constitution, which frustrated Hamilton, which also suggested maybe it's not a perfect document. One was who in government could proclaim American neutrality. For Hamilton, he clearly thought this was a power of the president. For Thomas Jefferson, he thought this was clearly a power for Congress. The funny thing here is that both agreed American neutrality is the most important thing, But Hamilton and Jefferson had another one of their classic squabbles over who's supposed to proclaim neutrality, who has the power to do so. Once again, same goal, but how you get there is important. If we're going to have this Constitution, procedure has to matter. And Hamilton would get a little frustrated that not everyone agreed with his procedure. That could lead to him rubbing some people the wrong way, because what he assumed to be true, not everyone agreed with. The Supreme Court not being as powerful of an entity as it is today, a lot was left up to haggling and negotiation among people in power. And Hamilton and Jefferson, while in the Washington cabinet, spent a lot of their time also trying to get President Washington's ear to convince him to read the Constitution in a way they found acceptable. And I think this is something Hamilton probably thought was beneath him, probably Jefferson too, to be fair. But they accepted Washington was more popular than they were. The people would listen if Washington leaned one way or the other. So they had to work on him, even though they felt what was in the Constitution was pretty obvious. And I didn't know where else to fit this in, but I think it's a story worth noting. Hamilton was actually stoned at a public meeting in Wall Street in July 1795 over his position on Jay's Treaty. So this idea that, political violence just got invented a few years ago is not rooted in any kind of fact. Hamilton was actually beamed in the head with a rock, whether it's a rock or stone, who's to say. But he did take one to the head, maybe two to the head. The literature is disputed on that. So for a bunch of people who, we always assume got along really well because they're still the United States and still a constitution, they didn't always act friendly towards one another. And this war on Hamilton. As you can imagine, if you put all this effort into the Constitution, get it ratified, and then people read it differently than you hoped, or didn't treat it with the respect you want to, it can make you feel a little hopeless. And Hamilton, in 1802, writing to Gouverneur Morris, he referred to the Constitution as a frail and worthless fabric. And that just shows you how frustrated Hamilton got. I believe that he just spoke out of frustration, anger. He didn't really mean it, but he meant it enough to write it down at some point in his life. And this was getting kind of near the end of his life. So even the father of the Constitution could be frustrated with it, could be disappointed with it. Maybe that's just what parenthood is at times. So this is my intro. Even Hamilton, one of the biggest champions, if not the biggest champion of the Constitution, could be frustrated by it. But maybe that's an argument for the Constitution being something special, that it's its own entity. Now I'll move on to the ratification of the Constitution in Rhode Island. And this will be the bulk of my argument, because it's almost a minor miracle that Rhode Island ratified the Constitution. And I'm not, I think, being extreme by saying miracle. Rhode Island did almost everything it could to not ratify the Constitution. Took a lot of threats of force to change minds. But let's figure out why it took such extreme measures to get there. Especially from the Constitution that a lot of people, especially today, think is a pretty solid document. Why would people in Rhode Island feel that way? Well, there are plenty of reasons why. So let's go into their history a little bit. Rhode Island had a tradition of individualism, separatism, local democracy, and liberty, both civil and religious. And this will come from Connolly, from his edited volume with Kaminsky. This is on the chapter in Rhode Island. And Connolly noted that Rhode Island became a home for radical Protestants, as well as other religious refugees, Portuguese Jews, French Huguenots. Rhode Island was basically a place where if you couldn't find a religious home in the U.S., you're probably going to have your best chance to find it in Rhode Island. Didn't mean it sat well with everyone. Is it ironic, considering the Puritans left England for exactly that reason? Yeah, a little bit. But religions were carving up the colonies that would eventually become the United States and saying, well, we're mostly going to impose order here. But in Rhode Island, they were pretty receptive to everybody. This created a little bit of tension with their neighbors. In fact, Massachusetts Puritans classified Rhode Island as a moral sewer. So the neighbors like that, you can understand it's tough living in Rhode Island at the time. Also, Rhode Island was a tiny colony. They're the tiniest state. They don't have a lot of land. And during the course of their existence, as a colony, as a British territory, they had to deal with neighbors trying to steal their land, whether it's Massachusetts, Connecticut, what have you. They were really struggling to exist, so much so that they went out and sought a charter from the king directly. And in 1663, King Charles II, I have to specify, we now have a King Charles III. It just took almost 400 years to get another one. We'll see how it works out for him. But King Charles II would agree that Rhode Island has a right to exist, and he signed his name to it. So at least by the mid-1600s, Rhode Island has a right to exist, but that doesn't mean everything's forgotten. That doesn't mean they're going to magically get along with their neighbors. It means we're going to have Rhode Island. I'm sorry about that. So Rhode Island starts developing a bit of a reputation. And the reason they have such a reputation is because they're combative. They're combative with their neighbors until they need them. They're combative with the British until they need them. This is the story of Rhode Island. They want to be left alone until they can't make it on their own. That is what it means to be in Rhode Island, to be a member of that state. For instance, there's a case where British officials were looking at the destruction of the Gaspee. And that was a ship docked outside of Providence. It was destroyed by protesters, and British officials got so angry they proclaimed Rhode Island to be a downright democracy. I understand that doesn't sound harsh, but from officials of the British Crown calling Rhode Island a downright democracy, it is an insult. They're saying the mob is running away with things. There's no order. They just go at the whim of whatever's popular, whatever the majority wants. There's no predictability. Rhode Island can be so rogue. In fact, many called it Rogue Island during its time. So even though they loved the British, and especially the king in the mid-1600s, as we get into the 1700s and they start feeling pushed upon by the British Empire, all that goodwill evaporates. And Rhode Island had somewhat of a penchant for attacking British merchant ships. And this was before the Boston Tea Party. Boston Tea Party is obviously more important for history, but it doesn't mean they were alone. Rhode Island was doing this too. Probably because they were so small and didn't catch as much attention. But this is part of the rebellious streak of Rhode Island. This is part of them being who they want to be, doing what they want to do. And obviously the British eventually get fed up. And they do wind up occupying Rhode Island's territory. So now, with the threat of the British at their doorstep, Rhode Island rushed to support the Articles of Confederation. However, when the British were no longer a threat, when they left North America, or at least the colonies, they stayed in Canada, Rhode Island would rarely comply with the national government. Even though Rhode Island was very into having a national government, the second they didn't need them and they were going to be safe, they basically started to ignore the national government. They didn't want to listen to it. They didn't feel like they had to, even though they begged for their help probably 10 years earlier. Once again, this is Rhode Island. This is their psychology. This is what it means to live in Rhode Island. This is the identity they've developed. And this relationship never really got any better through the 1780s. The Confederation Congress tried to unseat the Rhode Island representative. Critics from other states characterized Rhode Island as the quintessence of villainy, which I think is just a marvelous turn of phrase. Pretty insulting too. You are really basically the epitome of what it means to be a villain. That's Rhode Island. Also, the Connecticut Wits. I learned that the Connecticut Wits are a thing in my research. they penned a long poetical satire about the state of Rhode Island. So states are penning satires about Rhode Island. Things aren't really looking terrific in terms of their relationship with the United States or even their neighboring states. This is the background of Rhode Island. But there were political reasons as well. Rhode Island had a strong hostility towards slavery. And one of the problems they have with the Constitution is that the Constitution would ban federal action on the slave trade for 21 years. Rhode Island felt that that was unacceptable. So now they have strong political reasons to be against the Constitution. And 5 weeks after the Constitutional Convention, Rhode Island would actually ban the slave trade within their state. Now, they certainly weren't the only state that was against slavery, but they probably were the strongest. The federal Constitution that really kicked the can down the road in terms of dealing with slavery was not something they were all that tolerable of. For all these reasons, all this history and politics so far, hopefully you can see why Rhode Island would be the last state to ratify the Constitution. And why it's almost, why I think it personally, it's a miracle they did. But we can be more specific. We can talk about the journey to ratification, now that I've kind of set up the background. At that time, so we're talking late 1700s here, 1787 through 1790, basically. The big party in Rhode Island was the Country Party. As the name suggests, they represented the country, not the United States, country, rural areas. They prioritized the farmer over the merchant. So they were popular inland. Once you got closer to the coast, especially Providence, Newport, they were less popular. But most people in Rhode Island lived away from the coast, so the Country Party was entrenched. They were strongly entrenched. They were the party in power. And one of their policies was to issue paper money. Under the Articles of Confederation, states had the power to coin their own money if they wanted to, and the Country Party took advantage of that. For them, it was advantageous. The advent of paper money helped get more money into the system. It was easier to print, cheaper to print, easier to circulate, and it helped pay down debt, which was a big goal for Rhode Island. This was another qualm with the Constitution. The Constitution said debts could only be paid in gold and silver coin. Rhode Island didn't want that. It would have become more difficult and more expensive to pay off their debts. So we have another political reason entrenched in Rhode Island. And also it clashes with the most popular party in the state. Citizens of Rhode Island were concerned about the federal government's ability to tax. They felt that the federal government would tax their land, which was not a popular thing. Also, that they would tax the polls. They would tax Rhode Islanders when they went to vote, and Rhode Islanders liked to vote. They probably voted more than most states at that point. So if they're voting more often, and the federal government enacted a poll tax, that would make things more expensive for the average Rhode Islander who wanted to participate in democracy. So these are more political issues showing up and explaining why Rhode Island's a little hostile with the Constitution. But they didn't just feel that way overnight. Even the Constitutional Convention that was held in 1787 in Philadelphia, Rhode Island did not vote to hold it. And then, once enough states voted to hold the Constitutional Convention, Rhode Island boycotted it. They just didn't feel it was worth their time. And this could have been bad for the United States. If not every state showing up to negotiate and participate, it could send a negative message. However, the Massachusetts Sentinel, a newspaper at the time, called the Rhode Island boycott joyous rather than grievous. They were so much happier for not having Rhode Island there and having to deal with them. So this may have helped all parties involved at the Constitutional Convention get along and draft the Constitution, that they didn't have to worry about Rhode Island kicking up dust and maybe starting needless fights or fights that no one else wanted to have. So Rhode Island didn't show up, they just let other states negotiate the Constitution. Governor John Collins, the governor of Rhode Island at the time, wrote the Federation Congress and explained that because of the state's democratic traditions, they would have to vote on delegates instead of having the Rhode Island General Assembly select delegates. Because of that, it would take too much time, and if it sounds like he was passing the buck, he was. Because Congress would write him back and actually write the Rhode Island General Assembly as well and remind them that the Rhode Island General Assembly selected delegates to sign the Declaration of Independence and to ratify the Articles of Confederation. So this idea that the people of Rhode Island needed to vote on delegates was, pretty much coming out of nowhere because it was good enough for the Declaration of Independence and the current Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. So the national government of the United States didn't believe Governor Collins. They just thought it was a tactic. And it looks like it probably was. So Congress recommended that each state choose delegates through their state legislatures. Rhode Island said, no, we're going to hold an election. So after the Constitutional Convention ends in late fall 1787, Rhode Island's General Assembly will convene in early 1788. In 1788, they would vote to hold an election on whether or not to ratify the Constitution. This was set for the fourth Monday in March. So we have an election. The results are pretty much what you would assume they are at this point. About 92% voted against the Constitution. A little over 8% voted for. To put that in whole numbers, 2,711 people voted against the Constitution, 243 voted for. Now, those numbers are a little skewed, I will confess, because citizens of Providence and Newport boycotted the election. They found it to be fraudulent. They would refuse to participate in it. And based on the election for governor from the previous year, that's a little over 1,300 people who could have voted. However, that still wouldn't have been enough to swing the election, even if all of them voted to ratify the Constitution. But showing you there's division in Rhode Island, even though a clear, overwhelming majority are against the Constitution. So they're not going to ratify the Constitution, and they're not going to rush to do it. They feel like they don't have to. From 1788 to 1790, there would be 12 calls to hold a ratifying convention. The Rhode Island General Assembly would shoot all 12 requests down. They're not going to entertain the question. They're not going to deal with it. And they're hoping other states will bail them out and not ratify the Constitution. As long as they have that, they can keep up the fight. However, in 1788, the necessary 9 states will ratify the Constitution. So Rhode Island's kind of on the outside looking in now. And tempers are starting to flare a little bit in the state. For instance, on July 4th, 1788, a group of Federalists, supporters of the Constitution, wanted to get together to celebrate 11 states ratifying the Constitution and it becoming law of the land. Rhode Island was still a holdout, of course. North Carolina was the other holdout, but there was enough to make the Constitution law of the land. They wanted to celebrate that. Well, a mob of anti-federalists banded together to shut down that celebration. Again, this idea of protest, counter-protest, everything going kind of crazy, that's not new. We didn't invent that. If anything, we're using a very classic American technique. And it's, just swinging back into vogue. This happened in Rhode Island. They're fighting over the Constitution, but there's no political progress being made. And now the United States government's getting frustrated. So in July 1789, Congress pushed the enacting of tariffs on Rhode Island. Basically, the United States Congress said if Rhode Island will not ratify the Constitution, along with North Carolina, then we're going to treat them as foreign countries. We're going to put a tariff on their goods, an extra tax on their goods, because They're not operating by the Constitution. So why should we treat them as an American state when they're not acting like one? Governor Collins is distressed by this. He gets Congress to push it back until January 1790. Then in January, he gets them to push it back to April 1st, 1790. But Congress makes it clear, April 1st, 1790, this is it. We will start taxing you extra. So if you don't ratify the Constitution, you got to deal with that. So Congress has made its say. Also, Vice President Adams will throw his opinion out on this. Vice President Adams suggested that the United States should treat citizens of Rhode Island as foreigners and strip away their legal protections should they fail to ratify the Constitution. The federal government's getting frustrated. They're getting aggravated. So now Rhode Island is facing mounting pressure from inside. They're facing mounting pressure from outside as well. Then they lose their friend, North Carolina. North Carolina will ratify the Constitution in November 1789. Once this happens, Rhode Island is standing alone. There's no other state they can point to as saying, well, other people disagree with the Constitution. It's solely Rhode Island. And even President Washington is going to make a statement without directly making a statement. Around November 1789, President Washington, by the way, President Washington has been, elected and sworn in. Obviously, if Congress is making acts, they've been elected and sworn in. We have a government, and Rhode Island's still not really a part of it. But President Washington ignored Rhode Island when he made a tour of New England. He specifically made a point to not go to the state. This is embarrassing for Rhode Island. Washington was a popular figure, and for him to ignore them was embarrassing. So now they're facing pressures from their own citizens, from the federal government, and even the president's sending them a message that you need to fall in line. So we're starting to see the resistance to the Constitution build, but still not there. We're still in late 1789. However, Rhode Island's going to make small movements towards ratification. The Rhode Island General Assembly is going to print out 12 amendments proposed by the United States Congress and circulate them among their citizens. The point of this being that if they show these amendments to the citizens and say, hey, if enough states ratify them, they become part of the Constitution, they're trying to soften the blow of the Constitution. They're trying to say, well, yes, we may not love the Constitution, but the addition of these 12 amendments potentially could make the Constitution more tolerable. We could, get over our dislike of the Constitution and say, you know what, we're willing to work with it under these parameters. So that's a baby step forward. That's progress. In January 1790, the Rhode Island Senate was in a 4-4 tie. The Rhode Island General Assembly voted to hold a ratifying convention, but we needed the Rhode Island Senate to vote for it. But they tied at 4-4. Governor Collins broke the tie, and he voted to hold the ratifying convention. This would be costly. This would cost Governor Collins his political career. A few months later, the Country Party would punish him and basically remove him from the governorship. And that's pretty much done politically. But this is him taking a stand. He's the one negotiating with Congress about the tariffs I mentioned earlier and other issues with the United States. He finally votes to hold the convention. Pays a steep price though. So in March of 1790, Rhode Island finally holds a ratifying convention. The first thing they do is propose an additional 18 amendments they'd like to see in the U.S. Constitution. So right now, Congress, the United States Congress had passed 12 amendments, proposed 12 amendments. Rhode Island would like an additional 18. By the way, they're not going to get them. But this is showing that they're not happy with the Constitution, and if they have to live with it, there need to be some changes. The Constitution needs to be changed to suit Rhode Island. And before they seriously talk about ratification, they adjourn until May. So they take, a little over a month of a break. However, they have statewide elections in April. I'm going to cut them a little slack there. They probably had to halt the convention. And in that election in April, the Country Party replaces John Connor with Arthur Fenner. So Arthur Fenner is going to run for governor and he's going to win. Country Party dominates the state. The Federalists within Rhode Island actually nominated Fenner as well. It's not because they liked him. They didn't like him at all. But the Federalists knew they had to compromise. They had to keep their eye on the prize, and that prize was ratifying the Constitution. And having a small political squabble over the governorship of Rhode Island, they might lose some moderate Country Party members who they might be able to talk into voting to ratify the Constitution. So they get practical, like Hamilton. They play ball. They understand that this isn't perfect, but we have a bigger goal. So the Federalists are trying to get along. They are trying to be practical. However, people are getting frustrated at this point. Because when is Rhode Island ever going to get with the program? So the cities of Providence and Newport on May 24th, 1790, authorized their delegates to the ratifying convention that if Rhode Island fails to ratify the Constitution, they will explore the idea of secession. So that is two big cities in Rhode Island talking about leaving Rhode Island. Now, they're not neighboring other states necessarily, so would they have been enclaves? Would they have been United States territories? Who's to say? It's not going to get very far. We're near the end of the story. But these big cities are exploring the idea. Whether it was just a threat to prompt action or whether they were genuine, your guess is as good as mine. At the federal level, the United States Senate drew up a bill to suspend trade with Rhode Island. Also, they demanded payment of Rhode Island's Revolutionary War debt. And they made it clear that non-compliance, especially with paying the debt, could be grounds for the use of military force in Rhode Island. So now the federal government's making it clear. You better be able to pay us back if you're not going to ratify the Constitution. If not, we could send in the military to seize your territory. At that point, it would have been over. They probably would have thrown out the Country Party government, installed a new government that would have ratified the Constitution. We can look ahead in American history and look at, the United States post-Civil War and then Reconstruction to see that that's probably what would have happened. It's probably a good guess. So now, Rhode Island's risking invasion, losing trade. They're going to be hurt in many different ways. So after a week of fighting, the Federalists in Rhode Island force a vote. So on May 29th, the convention's actually going to vote on whether or not to ratify the Constitution. And the Constitution was ratified by a 34-32 vote, a slim margin. What should be noted, even though this is a victory for the United States and for the Constitution, that 3 anti-federalists were not present for this vote. What happens if they were there? They're anti-federalists. They're probably not big fans of the Constitution. Would they have voted against it? If so, that would have been 35-34 against. If even 2 had shown up and voted against the Constitution, we'd have a 34-34 tie. And that the chairman breaks all ties in the convention in Rhode Island. So what would have happened there? The chairman was anti-federalist. He probably would have voted against the Constitution. We would not have had ratification. We'd probably be teaching something more interesting, like the seizing of Rhode Island. We had to add that to history books. But we got lucky, 34-32. Rhode Island ratifies the Constitution. It's officially the law of the land for all of the original 13 states. And once Rhode Island produced a formal bill and officially voted on it, because it's a convention, they're going to have many votes. They also proposed an additional 21 amendments. Once again, this is a kind of a protest by Rhode Island to say, yeah, we ratified the Constitution, but there are at least 21 things it could do better. So they're not saying rah rah Constitution, we love the Constitution. It's we're going to suck it up, but you should know you got a lot of work to do. But to end this on a happier note, in August, President Washington made a special trip to Rhode Island. Kind of the president's way of saying bygones are bygones. You know, it took a couple of years, but we're glad you ratified the Constitution. We're glad you're part of the United States. We're happy to have you. Let's move forward together. However, it harkens back to my central arguments. Not everyone in the U.S. loved the Constitution, certainly not in Rhode Island. And even Hamilton at times got frustrated. So even though we have this holiday and we should celebrate the Constitution, we should learn about it, it wasn't just universally loved back then the way it is today, or certainly loved more today than back then. And everyone who did love it had to fight really hard to have it. And I think learning about that struggle kind of makes this day even better because you understand it didn't just happen because a lot of smart people got together and agreed with each other all the time. We had it because of a lot of hard work that eventually meant something. Thank you, and that's now the end of my presentation.
That's amazing. I had never heard that background story. So let me start off by Alyssa, are there any questions? And while she's looking up for questions or whatever, I have a few questions. Oh, she said no questions right now. I know that different states will do their voting procedures in different ways. Does Rhode Island like hang on to some of that, I would say resentments or whatever? And are they still today, um, you know, given the history of the Constitution with them, or are they not wanting to do some of the procedures that we base on Constitution these days?
Well, I think, over 200 years later, I think Rhode Island's kind of with the program. I visited there, I want to say 2006. I didn't note anything out of the ordinary in that regard. I mean, there's probably some historians there who pride themselves on it and maybe use a lot of rhetoric, but I haven't seen anything specifically from Rhode Island that makes me think they're still battling the Constitution. I think future generations have come to embrace the document.
That's good. To an extent. They're probably like, no, no. Well, when I mean, like, wasn't the main uh idea was to get away from a monarchy? So it seems unusual that they would be willing to fight something that was going to make sure that they're not conquered by, this country or that country. Was that unusual?
I guess it depends where in the country we look. I mean, Rhode Island definitely, especially in this presentation, comes off as opportunist. I wouldn't say they're alone in that regard, but from their perspective, yes, the monarchy is really bad. But also having a government in Philadelphia, well, at the time, Philadelphia, calling all the shots wasn't the biggest step up. They wanted to make the calls for themselves. And they wanted to do it at the local level. They wanted the regular citizens, the regular freedmen of Rhode Island voting. And they wanted to trust that over what a union of 13 states together in Congress would produce. So for them, they really wanted to be left alone, but at the same time, they wanted to enjoy the protections of being part of a country and the trade and all the economic benefits without the political sacrifice. Maybe not all that dissimilar from the United Kingdom leaving the European Union. They lost a lot of economic opportunities there, and I know people over there who told me the exact same. But for them, having the political authority over themselves, the sovereignty over themselves was worth it. So I think Rhode Island was the same way. It's just they were a lot smaller, less economically important in the world, but they definitely wanted the protection. They wanted to exist. But even their own history with their neighbors made them wary. So maybe it was just a combative nature after all that time.
Well, and I can kind of understand it, because wasn't the founding fathers mainly like landowners? And they were going to have all the power, so I can kind of understand their hesitancy. Maybe we're going to lose the little guys again, like it was in the monarchy.
I think so. I mean that I think I could see Rhode Island criticizing someone like Hamilton. Hamilton had grand designs for the government, and it would not have been popular in Rhode Island. I I've never heard of him going there. There's probably a reason for that.
Well, it's interesting. I had never, well, I mean, not knowing a lot of history about, a lot of different states. It's curious that Rhode Island had played such a large part in the Constitution. And you'd mentioned before we started, don't get me started on New York. So that's a whole nother ball game, isn't it?
Yes, New York was the 11th state to ratify. That was Hamilton's home state, so it's a point of pride for him to get them to ratify the Constitution. But even for Hamilton, that was a massive uphill battle.
That's
He pulled it
interesting.
off, to his credit.
Why they made a play out of him.
Oh, he's definitely a figure worth learning about, even though his life kind of ends short, thanks to Aaron Burr. But there's a reason he's coined the father, even though I think you could also look at someone like Madison and give him that title. And Madison was probably the greatest proponent because he just loved the Constitution. He would gush over it, whereas Hamilton, I think, saw it as a means to an end.
Well, creating a government from literally nothing other than uh, we don't want to be a monarchy um, was a massive feat, and to get everyone on board to that. So to their credit, that was amazing, and to have the Constitution still being followed all these hundreds of years after, um, was just unbelievable, you know. But there are flaws. I agree.
Yeah, and it was definitely what government should be, which is negotiation and a series of compromises. The goal in compromise isn't to make everyone happy. I would argue the goal of a compromise is to make everyone equally miserable so they can go on with their lives.
I I have to agree with that. I have never heard that, but I have to agree with that, you know. That's true. You can't please everybody all of the time. That would be a little scary children of the corn thing.
It could be, and maybe in America it's more important that both sides look the other way and say, well, they're not completely happy, I can live with it. Maybe in times of strife and disagreement, you got to make sure you see that the other side's not totally thrilled so you don't feel like you're losing. I don't know if it's a great long-term strategy, but it might be a suitable short-term strategy.
Well, the very fact that most everything, including the Constitution, was a very small margin of voting. Um, that has been our country all these years, is a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and like you say, compromise. So, I agree. We've been this way for a very long time, and otherwise, I think if we were all thinking one thing, that would be back to that monarchy again. So,
It could be. I mean, an important part of majority rules is that a majority can be 51%. Not all majorities are 100%. And sometimes you just lose track of that because you're like, well, this is the historical narrative. This is where we were. This is where we are. So obviously everyone was on board, and I don't know if that was ever true at any point for anything, other than maybe a war, like World War II or something. But even then, there was one member of the House, she voted against it. She also voted against World War One. So even then, not 100%.
Yep. Yeah. Well, that's what we get in a democracy. We all have our opinions, which can be a good thing. So, well, thank you so much, Dr. Jordan, for visiting with us today and talking about the Constitution with us. Yeah, now we'll have to do another event to hear all about New York.
Yeah, I have the information. I'm ready.
Okay. All righty. Well, we really appreciate you taking the time today to go ahead and talk with us about this lesser known struggle. I did not know about it, and I'm sure no one else, not very many people, except people in Rhode Island, probably.
All right, okay.
Yeah. Well, and so guys, Alyssa, any more questions before we go? Um, Nope, not yet. All right. Well, you guys, uh we have Dr. Jordan on campus. So if you've got any other questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat and I mean in the comments, and we'll go ahead and get them to him. Before we go, I wanted to remind you guys that we still have a lot going on this week. Today at 4 o'clock, we have philosophy and popcorn. Basically, we ask philosophical questions and everybody gets a chance to answer them in whatever's, their opinion. There's no crosstalk, there's no debate, there's no judgment. If you feel you have to talk when it's not your turn, you eat the popcorn. And that way, it's a really cool way for everybody to learn to listen to other opinions. That's at 4 o'clock today. Then on Wednesday, we have Dr. Mervyn Roberts, who's going to be talking about the use of GIS analysis during the Vietnam War. So a little bit more history, but further more toward the present. So we have that on Wednesday at noon, and that will be here on Facebook. And then in person, we have the Explosive Dance Company in Killeen that's going to be coming at noon on Thursday and teaching everyone a really cool dance and the latest dance moves. So make sure that you guys come to all these amazing events this week and just keep coming. And so thank you again, Dr. Jordan, and we will see you later and we will see everybody else. So you guys have an awesome day and check us out next time. Thanks. And Alyssa, if you will take us out.